Can you hear me okay? Is that all right? We were waiting for you guys.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Welcome to the Old City Cemetery, established...
You haven't set the ghost.
What's that?
You haven't set the
Oh,
ghost.
I have it on the Echo Scary Voice. Okay. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Real world voice. The Old City Cemetery, established in 1849, is a grant of 10 acres from John Sutter Jr., right over there, the good Sutter, and expanded and shrunken over the years. This is a fabulous resource. We're going to pass through the Rose Garden area, which is in bloom right now, and it's beautiful. And we have everyone from politicians to criminals and police here. I started researching this, and hey, how you doing? How's your cemetery doing? Oh, you can tell me later.
Real good. It's not underwater no more.
Good, right, that's a good thing. I stopped at about 53 Sac PD officers that I discovered that were buried in here. And I'm sure there's more. Everywhere around you. We don't have time to talk about them all, but they're here. Right behind you on this tree over here, that flag is Thomas Hancock. He was deputy marshal under James Lansing in the early 1850s. Right over this way where that flag is Jeremiah Woods. He was a police captain in the 1880s and 90s. And there's so many people in here. There's, well, let's just read my stuff here. Propelled by the explosive growth of the gold rush, Sacramento rapidly went from a sleepy Mexican village to a big, messy city full of tents and saloons. The new city had a tremendous need for infrastructure, not just roads, but law enforcement and courts. Sacramento's midway location between San Francisco and the mines made it a perfect supply site for merchants, but also a huge itinerant population, not all of whom were fine, upstanding, temperate members of society. In the early gold rush years, Sacramento had only a marshal and a couple of deputies. The marshal received $40 a month. Even later, the city only had 8 to 12 policemen. And I want to point out the interpretive displays here, over here. Officer Paul Brown over here with the hand up has put these together. He is a police officer at Sac PD and a historian working through the Sacramento Police Officers Association's nonprofit, the 1849 Foundation. And yeah, I encourage you to read these. Several of the people that we are going to be discussing today are up on these boards. Notably Max Fisher,
Tom Beckner, George Chapman.
George Chapman, yeah, who is the first police officer to give his life in the line of duty in Sacramento. We'll end our tour with that story. We have so many stories, and we really should get going, but I do want to say this is, with a couple exceptions, only Sac City police officers on this tour. There's so many of them, I couldn't do them all, and have enough to do another tour on sheriffs, even lawyers, if we want to go that way. So, all right, let's get collective, and was with the department through the 20s. Ed Cripp quit for a more lucrative career in the saloon business, which you'll find a theme on this tour. And excuse me. Somehow the saloons that Ed Cripp ran always had gambling going on, and somehow the police were never able to close them. When they got there would be no gambling going on, or that they would be ordered not to go into the place. So eventually Ed wanted to build a baseball field, but he wanted to be able to serve whiskey at it. And the city board of trustees said no, so Y Street here was the edge of town. So where the Target is right there was outside of the city limits, and he built it right there and served as much whiskey as he wanted. This right here is John Quincy Brown. He wasn't a cop, he was a mayor though. And when he was mayor in 1881, the city needed money desperately, so he went after money from an unexpected source. The unusually frank new mayor said he understood why the existing gambling laws were not being enforced. The police were using the law to extort money from gamblers. In December 1881, the Board of Trustees sent a letter to each member of the city police department stating that they must arrest anyone involved in illegal gambling at penalty of dismissal. The letter had little, if any, effect. In June 1882, the board passed an ordinance giving police additional authority to close down gambling games, but the games continued until the law was repealed a year later. Then they waited for a month. I guess they just didn't want to be told what to do or something. And they shut the games down. But according to Mayor Brown, it was because they had stopped being paid off. And Brown even proposed a radical step of licensing gambling rather than prohibiting it, saying that he wanted the money that the gamblers had been willingly paying to the police to be paid into the city treasury instead. In his second term in 1884, the ordinance was passed, being the first time gambling had ever been licensed in the city of Sacramento. Obviously too progressive for its time, it was repealed after only 4 months. Its degree of accommodation with the robber barons of the faro tables conflicted with both the ideology of the growing populist movement and the financial prosperity of the police department. And Brown was soundly defeated at the next election. So let's move on. We are surrounded by policemen. They're dead though, don't worry. Right over here is the John Drayman. This nice monument with the urn with the drape on top of it. And he was an odd fellow. He was a carrot shop owner who became a beat cop and was later a county supervisor. And he's related to the Didion family, John Didion. Over here we passed, coming up here, William Katzenstein. His father, George, was a business leader with fruit packing and was a leader in the Masonic movement, the Odd Fellows, and was leader of the Good Templars, which were a temperance movement. And his son, William, was a police officer, I think briefly worked in Sacramento, but he moved to Tucson. And I think 1902, he was killed in the line of duty in Tucson. He was assistant fire chief and he was a police officer. And there was a fire in a store, and he and another officer were there making sure that the place didn't get looted. And he went down the street to a hotel that had a phone to use the phone to see what was taking so long for the fire crew to get there. And across the street there was a fire plug. So he took off his gun belt, left it at the hotel, and went over to turn on the fire plug. Now across the street was a saloon with a young man, and Katzenstein had arrested this man's friend this morning, and he was under the influence, was not happy. And he saw him take off his gun belt, and he waited until he was bent over the fire hydrant and put 5 shots in his back. And William died. Eventually, his father George was made master of the Good Templars, not just of the United States, but of the whole world. And you have to wonder if his son's death had any influence on that. Let's see here. Oh, okay. Since we're in the shade, we're going to stay here. But this plot here, right there, is John Rogers. And I do have some visual aids. Vince, do you want to pass those things up? Okay, and going around are some pictures of John Rogers. John Rogers is buried in that one right there. Yeah, that's all. That's it. My lovely assistant Liz. Thank you very much. Rogers was chief of police, and he was also at 90 years old when he died in 1940. He was the oldest living volunteer fireman in the state. He arrived in Sacramento in 1860 with his parents after going around the Horn in a windjammer. Sounds scary. They lived at 5th and K Streets next door to the Eureka Engine Company, and he started as a torch boy at age 10. A torch boy, if you don't know, is somebody that ran ahead of the fire truck to light its way, to look for obstacles and to yell and get people out of the path. The thundering herd coming. If you can imagine letting your 10-year-old run in front of a team of horses in the dark on potthole roads, you know. So anyway, he eventually joined the fire department and became chief, and contributed to this book called Memories of the Fire Service, in which he said about being the chief of police, it was said candidates were forced to use all of their political influence besides contributing heavily to the campaign fund. No pay, no go. No go, no job. So Rogers, with that in mind, Rogers was temporarily made chief by Mayor Steinman, but he didn't get confirmed by the Board of Trustees. They didn't like him, which was the beginning of his troubles. And Rogers' term was when new requirements for police officers came in. So the old officers didn't think they were going to be around much longer, and the new guys didn't know their job, so enforcement suffered. Or at least the B said that. And there were undoubtedly politics involved as well. This guy here is Moses Drew. Moses is buried in this cemetery as well. And Moses, his brother Warren had been chief before Rogers. Rogers deposed Moses Drew's brother Warren. So it was Moses Drew's pleasure to personally serve Rogers with an order to vacate the office of chief immediately. And then the mayor appointed the jailer, John P. McManus, to be temporary chief until somebody else could be appointed as chief instead of Rogers. Guess who got appointed chief? Moses Drew. All right, that's it for that one. We're gonna wander through these bands here to close to the Crocker area. It will probably last a total of an hour and a half to 2 hours. If you get too hot, you have to leave. We will be terribly offended, but we'll get over it. So, but by the way, I forgot to mention there is a little iron box that's bolted to the ground that is up by the front kiosk. It accepts money. You can put money in it. No, thank you. All the money, we're all volunteers here. I put dozens of hours into researching this tour. Everybody here are volunteers, and all the money donated goes to the repair and maintenance of these headstones. So, right here is Harry Butler, and there's a picture of him going around. Harry Butler had driven the patrol wagon. He accidentally shot himself in the foot and got promoted to desk sergeant. Where he didn't have to move around, he just stayed in the police station and let the crazies come into him. He got made sergeant after the dismissal of the previous sergeant for wife beating in 1906. And at first doctors thought he wouldn't ever recover, but eventually his foot did get better. And there's dozens of reports in the newspaper of people coming to the police station. When new physical standards were imposed for officers in 1906, chief and patrol drivers were exempt. New rules included things like age restrictions, 25 to 45, height requirements, 5'9" to 6'4", weight requirements, 150 to 180, no glasses, no fits, no heart conditions. One more new rule was that your waist measurement could not exceed your chest measurement. And look at the picture of him there. The Sacramento Union newspaper specifically mentioned several current officers who would not meet that new standard, mentioning Butler by name, and Bob Ash, who we'll meet later. But that's not the worst. There is another officer, George Radnich, who grew an inch and a half. Because he didn't meet the height requirements at the time, and then when they remeasured him, boom! A 39-year-old man grows an inch and a half in a month. It's great. So when Butler died, the police captain blamed the bad air in the old city jail for making him sick. The police sent a star of flowers across the center of which was the number 2, the number of the star that the sergeant had worn. And that's it. Sorry, we have to go back into the sun now. Over this way. This plot here with the lovely flowers is... Where is... What's the name on there?
Hamilton.
Oh, Hamilton. All right. Let's not be that important. He was early. I can't remember the name there because I'm not looking at it. But he was an early officer in the early 1850s who married John Reeves' widow. Reeves was the proprietor of New Helvetia Cemetery, so he became superintendent of New Helvetia Cemetery. Next month, I'm giving a tour on New Helvetia Cemetery, which is a cemetery that used to be where Sutter Middle School is today. And, we think there's a few bodies left there, just to let you know. And if you want to hear about hear about that, come to that tour. So right over this way, several plots in, right next to those 2 mausoleums is Len Harris. Len Harris was just an amazing officer. He was an officer in the early 1850s. I think he was there during the squatters' riot. In 1851, when a vigilante broke into his jail and hung the murderer of Frederick Rowe, he was unable to stop them. They pulled down a lamppost and smashed in the door and hung him. And the spot where they hung him is right about mid-court at Golden One Center. Len Harris was a city police officer. He worked at San Quentin for a while, and then he was an officer for the Central Pacific and later Southern Pacific for like 30-something years. Way too long. He should have retired. He had gotten shot in a robbery attempt a few years earlier, and he told his wife he was going to quit because he was hurt. He wasn't quick on the draw anymore. It shot him in the shoulder, which ended up and hurting him later. This is Len Harris here. Good-looking guy, member of the veterans of the Mexican War. And let's see here. Okay, so anyway, he was holed up waiting for a robber. Oh, I should tell you some more about Len Harris. He was a fantastic officer. He once chased a guy for 3 days on a horse, riding for 3 days until the horse died, and Lynn didn't. He chased guys through the desert into the mountains and had a shootout in a snowstorm. He chased guys into hostile Indian territory and solved murders. He recognized people from San Quentin. When he became a Central Pacific officer and Southern Pacific officer, he still maintained a Sacramento County detective's badge so he could enforce the law. It'd be easier for him. He was holed up at a train station in Boulder Creek waiting for a robber. They had a tip he was going to rob the Wells Fargo Express station. So they were waiting, him and another cop were waiting inside of a rail car that was outside the station. They saw the guy go in there, and Len went in and said, "Hold on, buddy, I got the drop on you." But the guy had his back to him, and he had his gun under his arm, and he shot it with his back to him. Shot Len, knocked him down, jumped out the window, and ran off. Of course, they caught him later. But and this was in the South Bay, and he lived in Oakland. The railroad had a railroad hospital that was in Oakland, so they tried to stitch him up. He got shot in 5 or 6 different places. He was going to die. So they took him to the hospital. They couldn't do anything for him there. He said, "I want to go home. I want to die at home." And he lived in the East Bay, somewhere, Richmond or something, a small town. So they got to the train station there, and they had their own private train. They got out, and there was nothing there. There was no cab, there was no hacks. So they found a milk truck and took all the milk out, and they put him in, and they took him home to his house for him to die with his family. And that's the Lynn Harris story, or part of it. I left out his crazy family. So come do another tour if you want to hear about that. This is the Thielen family monument. Joe Thielen was a 15-year veteran of the force who was fired for covering up for another officer being drunk on duty. A Sacramento native, Joe Thielen started with the force in 1907 and held the rank of patrolman, but had also done plainclothes duty and served as a wagon officer and was on traffic duty. Another officer, C.D. Mahoney, was found by the chief at the Sutter Hotel in a drunken condition. Thielen testified that he was not at the hotel with Mahoney, no. But testimony from the hotel manager said that they both were so disorderly they had to be asked to leave. Thielen later said he had made a mistake in his testimony, that he was sick with a high fever and that night and ill with influenza when he testified and didn't know what he was saying. The Board of Trustees meeting lasted until after 1 a.m. that evening, deciding Thielen's fate. His lawyer said he was a good officer and had been suspended only once before, a couple of years previously, when he had driven a patrol car with a flat tire and the chief had made an example out of him. He claimed he was too sick to know what he was saying in his earlier testimony. The council didn't buy it. His employment ended in March 1922, and he died less than 2 years later of a kidney ailment. So, that's Joe Thielen. All right, now that you got comfortable, we're going to go on down this way for you. Thank you. I know it's hot. Thank you for sticking with us. We're going to try and stay in the shade. This is the Pioneer Association plot. Everybody here was here in 1849, and they're very exclusive. They're kind of snobby, and they kind of thought they were better than everybody else. Actually, there's some Johnny-come-lately who got there January 1st, 1850, because he was stuck at the port of San Francisco on a ship, and there's a storm, and they're like, "You should have gotten on a rowboat and, you know, defied death to get here by 1849. You can't get in our organization." Eventually they let their their sons and daughters join eventually, because everybody was dying off. So, and now it's administered still by the Pioneer Association, but you don't have to be 170 years old to be in it. There are several police officers buried here as well. George Putnam, who's that other guy? Oh, Sam Deal is on the other side. Sam Deal was a maker of horse harnesses, and he arrived August 30th, 1849, and mined gold on the South Fork of the Yuba, made a bunch of money, and bought the Union Hotel on 2nd Street in Sacramento. Oh no, is this Diane? He was a police officer in the 1870s. In the 1850s, he was shot point blank in the chest by a man he'd arrested the night before. And the guy came up to him and said, "Why did you arrest me?" Pointed the gun at his chest and fired. The gun misfired, and the guy was convicted of attempted murder. Lucky Sam. So, in 1872, I had to preface this by saying the city had this really weird, messed up system where the officers had to run for re-election every year. They only had 12 officers, and usually had like 60 people that wanted to be cops, and had probably been promised it by, one of the city council members. And there was a 3-person board, the police commission, the mayor, the police chief, and the head board of trustee member. And they would each have different people that they liked, different political affiliations. So in 1870, and Deal had been chief of police. So in 1872, there were successive rounds of balloting. They had 2 guys against each other, so kind of like a reality TV show or something, So he barely missed making the cut. He lost out to Lynn Harris in 1872, being an officer. And this is after he had already been lieutenant and chief of police. That was no guarantee that you were going to keep your job. So ridiculous. Maybe it was because he was 55 years old at his advanced age there. That was considered rather decrepit back then. Although some of these police officers policed into their 70s and 80s. Carter Jackson is a black police officer, and he's not buried in the Pioneer. You can believe that. But Carter Jackson was a black police officer in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s in Sacramento, and I can't find very much information on him, but he definitely existed. There's arrest reports. He was a special officer. Special officers were part-time officers usually paid to patrol a certain area by businesses. And so he patrolled the downtown area, and he died at 86, and it says that he was an officer up until a couple of years before. So if you can imagine some 16-year-old punk getting arrested by some 83-year-old black guy, it's probably not a big morale booster back then. Good. Shouldn't be. All right, this is nice and shady, but we're going to have to move into the Hamilton Square Garden area. We're actually going right next to the Hamilton Monument, Eric, if you want to follow. Okay. Well, this is the Duhane family, our friend Carly, and a lot of local Sacramentans will remember Tom Duhane, the local broadcaster. This is his family? No, he's still here. No. The rest of his family did, like everybody. Yeah. So, the Duhane family plot has some interesting characters in it, and one of them is John C. Duhane. He died in 1916. John Duhane was a city patrolman who went into the saloon business with another cop, George Radnich, the guy who grew an inch and a half. They bought the Gem Saloon at 2nd and K Streets, which was notorious for disorderliness and gambling. Both officers eventually retired in 1907. When the new height requirements came, oh no, I already mentioned that. Both patrolmen had sought a 6-month leave of absence to go into the saloon business and wanted to get their jobs back if their venture failed. The city fathers disapproved, saying leaves of absence were for restoring your health or something like that, not entrepreneurship. They submitted their resignations and saloon application at the same board meeting, and an application for an electric sign. The B said that they had been tipped to act as they did, for if the leave of absence had been granted, they would have failed to get the saloon license, and if the license were granted last night, they would have been asked to resign on the spot. So they're smart, and they were hooked in, obviously. And they ran the gym for several years, and many news accounts were found of this period of police going out to the rowdy saloon, and the, Blue Noses being upset about the vice going on there, and somehow the police were unable to shut it down. I don't know why. After leaving the saloon business, Duhane separated from his wife and lived quietly in Stockton for a few years, until one day he was murdered. In 1916, he was found in his burned farmhouse. But after an autopsy, he was found to have a bullet hole in his head. The neighbor was acting squirrely, so they went and threw him in a cell, and he confessed. He said he had planned the murder and enlisted his brother-in-law, Emerson Hartman, who was a sailor, and they did it when he was on 48-hour leave. Hartman actually pulled the trigger, and they were soon found out and arrested. Hartman claimed that his sister had appealed to him for protection from Duhane. I guess from his advances, unwelcome advances. But Duhane wasn't around to defend himself, so that's all we can say about that. Since we are in this wonderful shade here, let's stay here, and if I can get my lovely assistant.
Oh, for a second there, I thought you were talking about me, Eric.
You are lovely.
Oh, thank
That's
you.
true.
Run around there.
Just not as.
Yeah. That is, well, there's two pictures in here. I mean, it's the same picture on both sides. That is a picture of Jack McCarty and the car that he crashed. Jack McCarty is buried in the middle veteran section there. He was an Ione native who was a Sacramento police officer who retired after almost 25 years service in 1937. Turns out he was asked to retire after hitting a fire hydrant with his patrol car at 10th and K Streets while intoxicated. He joined the force in 1913 and was the athletic sort, played in the Baseball Widows and Orphans League, which you have the information up at the front about that. And also was a sprinter and drove the patrol wagon for the department, and was a war draftee in World War I. Went and served. He went to Camp Kearney, where a lot of Sacramentans went to train. And April 1918 is when he was on a furlough from Camp Kearney. So after that, he went over to overseas with a heavy artillery company. So undoubtedly he saw service probably in Sargon or somewhere like that, where a lot of Sacramentans were. When he came back, he seemed to get in fights a little bit more. Have some problems. And drank. He was working back as a cop by December 1919, so probably went straight from the battlefield right back to patrolling the beat. That's not much break. On the night in question, 1916, where is it? Anyway, the night in question, he appeared for a shift at midnight and hit the hydrant a mere half hour later, so he was already drunk when he got there. The officers showed up at the scene, and you can see the picture there, and said, you're drunk, buddy, you're cut off. Go home, go to the station. And instead of that, he went off on a bender and hit all the bars. And they were waiting for him in his hotel room at 8 in the morning when he got back. And they took him to the hospital, did a blood test, and he was intoxicated, obviously. The city manager, he had been disciplined 7 times for various offenses: failure to report for duty twice, absence from duty, failure to report off duty, conduct unbecoming an officer, misconduct, and being intoxicated while on duty is 2 years earlier. At that time, the city manager, James S. Dean, had McCartney write and sign an undated confession to be used later if he screwed up again in 2 years. And it was just under the 2-year period, so Dean was trying to hold his nose to that agreement, make him do that. He demanded that the officer tender his resignation, but Jack did have defenders on the board because he'd been a cop for a long time. He was 55 days shy of his 20 years on the force, which he needed to retire to get your pension. And Dean said that the city manager said that his many suspensions and time off for sickness was why he was 55 days short at that time. But the city retirement board gave him a $100 a month pension after an examination from several doctors, including June B. Harris, who's buried here, that he was disabled, and no details were given other than he was unable to perform his duties. So he didn't withdraw the charges. Dean didn't withdraw the charges because he might try and get his job back at a later time. They just shelved it indefinitely, and the officer never returned to try and be a cop, and died 20 years later, and I have no idea what he did in between. I didn't see any reports or anything. Yeah, probably drank. All right, you ready to get in the sun again, folks? All right. This is the site of the where Ira Conran is buried. This is Ira Conran here. You want to pass that around? And Ira went to Sacramento schools and was a deputy sheriff. He was serving in that office in June 1896 when he thwarted an escape at the city jail. He took plenty of people to and from jail. He was a jailer. He had to round up escaped prisoners and served warrants on everybody from Chinese Tong members to corrupt state senators. He was active in the local Republican Party, and he and his wife were whist players. Any whist players here? No? Yeah, it's kind of not that popular anymore. In 1910, Conran ran for the office of sheriff. His Democratic opponent, David Ahern, filed notice with the county clerk of his withdrawal from the race. He didn't want to run. He said that he charged that a number of Democrats in his own party were supporting the Republican candidate, Conran, and he didn't have any chance to win. He wouldn't get a square deal from his own party. Well, the DA, or the state DA, gave the local DA an opinion that he could not withdraw. Ahern could not withdraw from the race. So, to everyone's surprise, Conran lost and Ahern won. There was undoubtedly some behind-the-scenes political machinations going on. And he did eventually become chief of police, and it was serving in that capacity in 1919 when the city tried its saloon buyback experiment. If you haven't heard of that, the city had a lot of dive bars and nuisance bars they were trying to shut down, and they decided to try and buy them and shut them down. And it didn't work very well because the places that were doing really well didn't want to sell out. They're making money hand over fist. The places that did want to sell were the places that were going to run themselves out of business anyway. So, and this is a picture of Robert Ashe. Robert Ashe is buried, well actually his family is buried there. That is the Ashe family monument right there. Bob Ash is actually buried in the Oddfield. I say Bob like I know him. I've read all of his stories. Big fan. Bob's buried next door. He signed the order for his family to be reinterred here from New Helvetia. They're all in New Helvetia and buried right there. And lots of interesting characters in that family too. If you want to hear about them and Bob's crazy brother, you got to come to the New Helvetia tour. This headstone here was actually found in someone's backyard and was brought here in the 1990s. So a lot of the New Helvetia headstones were just kind of stacked up and people took them and used them for gardening stones. So we're still finding them in that neighborhood today. Also, the headstone right behind that rose bush with the urn on top and the Masonic symbol, that is Patrick Dolan, and he was another early police officer. So we're going to kind of wander. Jackson was chief of police. He's not buried here. He's actually buried next door, but I want to mention to him. He was a B cop and became chief. In 1873, he had a broken arm, but he still had to go break up a bar fight. And the guys grabbed his legs and threw him on the ground. So the paper says, while they thus lay, Jackson's feet played a lively tune about his opponent's cranium. So he became chief, but he was not reelected. Hank Dillman was supported for chief and was more behind the scenes politics. Hank Dillman, who is buried right over there, wait a minute. He's buried right there, Hank Dillman, and we'll talk about him too. So he was not reelected for chief. His wife, Rita, was sick and was taking morphine pills. At the coroner's inquest, do you know where I'm going with this? She testified that he had said to her, I'm going to take those pills and throw them away. They could not hurt a flea. I'm going to take them myself. And he took a big handful. She didn't think he really did, but later he started passing out. She realized he actually had taken those pills. He called the doctor, but it was too late. And his wife said that he had often ridiculed the idea of suicide, and that he wouldn't have done that. So the coroner's verdict said, we find that death resulted from an overdose of morphine administered by his own hand, but whether with suicidal intent or not is unknown to this jury. So it's still unknown to this day. Hank Dillman, who replaced him, is buried right there. He was worked at the railroad shops, and he wasn't a police officer for very long. He was made chief of police, and he was a supporter of labor. He was an early member of the Knights of Labor, and he owned a bar across the street from the police station. And during the Pullman strike of 1894, they were looking for sympathetic supporters of the strikers. They went to his bar up on top of the roof. They found a bunch of rifles and brickbats to throw down on the police. So I don't know if it's him or somebody he supported. So anyway, he quit being he was the chief, and then he quit. He only lasted for a few years. That was how the job went off and went back into private business. Went into the saloon business, and right across the street, it probably had much the same clientele as he did when he was an officer, cops and criminals, coming to the bar. So he was despondent. His wife had died, and he was acting strangely, and his friends kind of were worried. He'd mentioned suicide, so they said, let's go have a drink at the bar. And he said, yes, let's go have a drink. And they went to the table and had a drink together, and they said, this is the last drink I will ever have with you, my friends. Took out the gun and shot himself right in front of his friends. Yeah, that's sad Hank Dillman story. He is not the only, he and O.C. Jackson are not the only chiefs of police that we have buried here who have committed suicide, actually. Josiah Watson is buried in the Potter's Field over here. He was the early chief of police, who in his later years when he got sick, he hid a pistol under his under his bed when he was sick. And when the caregiver left, he shot himself. Also, Ben Martz. Here we go. Oh, we can go show you that there. Ben Martz is, this is Ben Martz down here, and Len Harris is up here too. Ben Martz. Ben Martz is buried over there in the Oddfellows section. He was another chief of police. His wife died, and she's buried in St. Joe's. She left him some property, and he couldn't sell it. And he didn't have any money. He had to live in a boarding house. He committed suicide on his wife's grave at St. Joseph. They heard a shot. 2 people went out there, and they were actually people that knew him in real life, but they couldn't see him because he was draped over the headstone, holding it in one hand and the pistol in his other hand. And they went up there and rolled him over, and in quick succession they recognized him, and then, oh my God, I know why he did it. It's on his wife's grave. So what a horrible thing. I think that's all the suicides we have in this tour. I just wanted to get a light in the system. But you never know. So back here, we're going to meet Max Fisher, who's kind of the rock star of this tour.
Let's go.
Here's some pictures of Max Fisher.
Okay, yeah, find whatever shade you can. This is Max Fisher, and one of the reasons that I wanted to do this tour is Max Fisher. He's very, I discovered him a few years ago on another tour, and Max Fisher was a police officer in Sacramento for about 41 years, from about 1891 to 1932, and a lot of changes in technology and procedure happened in that time. And he was involved in many of them. And he was a pioneer in modern investigative and forensic procedures. He was not yet 14 when he came to Sacramento. A Russian hussar had kicked him in the butt for not saluting when a Prussian soldier went by. And he had been reading Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and he thought, well, let's forget this. I'm going to the United States and be free. He started in the express wagon business, driving a wagon, and instead of getting drunk and gambling in his off time, he studied law. So he started working as an investigator for the sheriff's department. And after that led to some busts, they made him a sheriff. He had a fantastic memory. He could arrest men that he'd seen and arrested once 20 years ago when they had a beard, or he'd seen in a mugshot book. He had a great eye for detail, and he was a pioneer in setting up identification files that had the ID, the MO, affiliations, markings, and stuff like that. And he was feared by lawbreakers from coast to coast as the man who don't forget. Max Fisher. He joined the police department in 1908 as a patrolman, became a detective sergeant. In 1913, he appeared in court as a Bertillon expert. Bertillon was a system that preceded fingerprints, and it was a system of measurements, mostly of the head and face, like what kind of shape eyes you have, how far apart are they, if your ears stick out, what kind of ears you have, how close are they to your eyes, are they tilted, and you can get a good description of somebody, but not perfect, and there were false positives and stuff. So anyway, fingerprints came in, and he became an expert in that. And he established the State Criminal ID Bureau during that time. And in 1917, the Bureau was threatened by legislative cuts. So he lobbied the legislature personally to convince them of its importance, and it missed being abolished by one vote. And his daughter, Alice, became his helper. And she actually helped, he was understaffed, and she helped him fingerprint and process people at age 17. If you can imagine letting your 17-year-old daughter process criminals. She also helped him register German-born enemy aliens during World War I. And they had a couple hundred Germans that were apparently too German, and they wanted to keep an eye on them, and he registered them in with his daughter. And in 1925, in response to a series of violent robberies, they established the Shotgun Squad, and that's the picture of the grim-looking policeman that was going around. And if you look at that picture, that is the Shotgun Squad, kind of like a primitive SWAT team. They would go kick down doors. And he's over 60 in that picture. So you got to think he's got to be well trusted and well respected. Actually, if you look at old police reports, the one thing all the old cops agree on is Max Fisher was very important to the department. He's always mentioned the old time stuff. He lived to be age of 80, and he bought all these headstones at once, so they're all sitting in his basement. After his wife died, he had that sitting in his basement until he died, ready to go, and walked 14 blocks every day, went to the butcher shop, had a picture of Lincoln at the head of his bed, and he taught his grandson to think about Lincoln's words about freedom, and he said, "I've never been kicked in the butt in this country either." So that's Max Fisher, rock star. Yeah, someday I would like to get a little more recognition for Max. All right, thank you. All right, we are headed Oddfellows Cemetery, which used to be part of this cemetery previously, and then Masonic is next door, and then Oddfellows, right? Okay, so Masonic Lawn, and then the Oddfellows next door. When, of course, we passed many police officers that we didn't mention. Over in this way here was Bob Goods. He was another patrol wagon officer, and he got in fights a little too much. Actually got in a fight with another officer, and when they're in uniform, it's maybe why he didn't last very long as an officer. Also, in an unmarked grave over in this middle section next to I still want to say Hereford House, but the Riverside Club is Thomas Arlington, a.k.a. John Murphy. Right? Is that his name?
Why are you stepping on my line, Tim?
Oh, okay. Oh, shut up. Start yakking, man.
All right. You can pass that around, please. Just because he has the same name as I do, he thinks he's cool. All right. Mysterious death of Officer William Arlington. Arlington on July 26, 1891, really began in 1880 when he first met his eventual murderess, Annie Manning. Annie was then but a 16-year-old girl who had recently run away from her mother's house in Stockton and come to Sacramento. Captain of Police Lee and Officer Arlington were sent to the disreputable establishment where Annie had taken up residence to retrieve her and return her to her worried mother. Using the ruse of needing to return to her apartment to put on a pair of shoes, she narrowly escaped Lee and Arlington when her delay made it obvious that she had no intention of returning with them. She escaped, the officer saw, by scaling an 8-foot fence in the rear of the house. But Arlington would not be able to escape Miss Manning. Annie's mad infatuation for Arlington that began that day, as well as the fiery temper she was known for, can be seen in a description of an incident told by City Attorney Hart. She was conducting a house of ill repute in the town of Willows for a portion of the year 1881. One evening, a ranch hand stepped in, and in the course of the evening's conversation remarked that he had recently come from Sacramento. "Do you know Officer Arlington there?" asked the woman eagerly. "Yes," replied the Granger. And then the newspaper puts in 4 lines, I'm assuming the first 3 words are son of a, he arrested me there for being drunk. The reference to Arlington aroused the woman to a pitch of ferocity that he could not control, and she picked up an ice pitcher, which she promptly smashed over her visitor's head. Despite Annie's temper, Officer Arlington must have taken pity on the poor young girl, and they began a relationship. And once they were together, nothing could separate them. Not the fact that she jealously dogged his footsteps at every turn, following him into restaurants, upon the streets, and even into the police station. Not the fact that his notorious relationship with this fallen woman nearly cost him his position with the police force if it weren't for an intercession by influential friends. Not even the fact that one night while they were sleeping together, he woke up just in time to stop Annie from putting a knife into his heart. But those things, definitely didn't help. Perhaps he, although he was known for having the courage of a lion, was just too afraid of Annie to leave her. But leave her, Annie's friends claimed it was because he thought she had started to lose her youthful good looks. He did. Or at least he tried to. July 8, 1891 saw a flurry of desperate notes addressed to Officer Arlington from Annie Manning. He tried to ignore them, but due to their number and tone, Arlington thought it best to meet with her in private rather than risk a scene on the street. Chief of Police Drew drove Arlington to her house where they parted company. What happened next, due to the fact that there were no living witnesses, is a matter of conjecture. Most likely, Annie pleaded with him to return, and he refused. Enraged, she pulled out a pistol that she had bought just the day before and put 3 bullets into her former lover, 2 in the neck and 1 in the head. She then turned the gun on herself. Officers found the deceased Annie Manning, 26, and the dying Officer Arlington, 40, lying on the floor in her darkened apartment. Annie's body was returned to her mother, and she was buried in Stockton. William succumbed to his wounds 18 days later, on July 26, 1891, and was buried on August 15th. Now, earlier I mentioned that Arlington died a mysterious death, but there really hasn't been much mystery up to this point. A spurned woman known for her violent temper and dangerous infatuation tricks her former lover, who had recently left her, into coming to her apartment where she shoots him with a gun she had recently purchased and then commits suicide. Seems pretty cut and dry. Truth to be told, the mystery didn't begin until after all of that. As I said, he died on July 26th, but wasn't buried until August 15th. Why the delay? You may have noticed on the sheet I passed around, everybody had a chance to, excellent. May have noticed on the sheet that I passed around, there are images of 3 people. Annie Manning, William Arlington, and someone named John Murphy. Soon after the incident, a resident of Sacramento by the name of Andrew Younger reported to a newspaper that Arlington bore a strong resemblance to that of John Murphy, the son of a prominent physician, Dr. Murphy, of Peoria, Illinois. Mr. Younger and Dr. Murphy were old friends, and several years earlier, the doctor had sent him a photograph of his son, John, whom he suspected of taking up residence in Sacramento, and asked Younger's help in finding him. 5 years before, John had visited his parents in Peoria for several weeks, and then returned to the West. Perhaps not coincidentally, Arlington had, 5 years before, gone east for several weeks, and his friends recalled him mentioning that he had gone to visit his parents, about whom he usually spoke very little. Although Arlington claimed to be from Virginia or Kentucky, a witness mentioned that in a conversation he had with Arlington, the officer knew all about Peoria and many of the citizens there. All this came as quite a shock to Chief Drew, who immediately contacted Dr. Murphy with a photograph and description of the deceased officer. Photographs of the 2 men published in the newspaper and other similarities had all of Sacramento, it seems, certain that John Murphy and William Arlington were just one man. Dr. Murphy, however, was not so easily convinced. One can only conjecture that Arlington took an assumed name and spoke little of his family because he did not want his parents to know of a menial but honest job he had held as an omnibus driver, and simply continued with the charade even after becoming a police officer. One can also only assume that Dr. Murphy refused to accept that William Arlington was his son because of the unusual circumstances of his death. Unable to convince Dr. Murphy of his son's second life as a Sacramento police officer, Chief Drew finally made the decision, more than 2 weeks after Arlington's death, to bury him in Sacramento rather than returning him to Peoria. John Murphy rests peacefully here in death at City Cemetery under the name that all of Sacramento knew him in life, William Arlington.
To come to something that's at 10 a.m. on a Saturday, for crying out loud, So
Yeah, I know. I wish we do have evening tours several times a year. We have. I should talk on there. We have these free walking tours at 10 a.m. Usually the first Saturday of the month. Occasionally we'll have 2 in a month in the summer years. We also have the lantern tours in October, which are a big fundraiser with actors and music and creepy stories. And we have several other evening tours this year. We have spiritualism tour. We have beer and baseball in July or August, I believe. And CSI in Sacramento is our next evening tour, and I think that's in the middle of June, something like that. Oh yeah, and we're also going to try and do a movie night in the cemetery. So we'll see if the city. Probably the Sacramento Picture. I try to get them to let me show Night of the Living Dead, but the city's all for it. The cemetery committee people are not, or some of them are not. Yeah. Yes.
I'm
Randy?
going down to San Diego next week, and my daughter and I are going to a cemetery movie.
Sure.
In one of the
Yeah, and I mean Hollywood Forever is famous for doing lots of movies there. But of course, you know, they have Marilyn Monroe and Bob Mitchum or whoever buried there too. So we don't have anybody famous like that here that we could do. You know, I wish we did. We don't really have anybody from the film era. We have like vaudeville stage people. You know. Anyway, this is the Turnverein plot. For those unaware, there's a plaque over here. The Turners were German immigrants, and the Turnverein was. Where's my Turner? You want to speak about the Turnverein?
The Turnverein was a political organization in Germany that was founded on athletics.
Right.
And
the athletics that was somewhat subversive to that establishment of the political.
they no longer have a political organization.
Right.
But the Turnverein does host volleyball, dodgeballs. They have an athletic club that's their trophy room is amazing for soccer.
How old is the building?
The building on 33rd and J Street was built in 1925 after a series of fires, if you read here, had destroyed their homes all around Sacramento. They had homes on L Street, they had homes on K Street.
And hey, can you rent out that hall, by the way?
You can rent out
Oh,
the
really?
hall. You can rent out the gym.
Oh.
You can rent out the 2 rooms upstairs. There's a banquet hall and a lodge hall. And the gymnasium, you can rent that out. There's a quinceañera tonight, which I'll be working.
Oh.
So that'll be fun.
Okay, thank you.
Good German tradition.
Yeah. And we're not going to be talking about any of them. I just had to point it out because we're here. And
The symbol right here means sound body, sound mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just say that.
Okay. All right. Oh, where's my... Here we go. Here we go. This is a picture of George Nagel. And we'll pass that around. George is buried right over here where that blue flag is, next to that lady. He was a cop who became a city detective, and I don't really know that much about him, so we'll skip to our next guy. This guy, the late Thomas Dwyer. Dashing fellow. He was the youngest He was the youngest chief of police in Sacramento's history. He was born in Sydney, Australia, and grew up in Sacramento, worked in the paint department at the railroad shops, and taught boxing at the Sacramento Athletic Club before being elected chief. He died in office, leaving behind his wife, a 6-year-old boy, and a newborn boy. His son was born a week before he died. And a few months before his death, he had a serious accident. He was trying to stop a runaway buggy and was dragged behind a horse for a while. And he got internal injuries. and got sicker and eventually died. He was ordered to stay in bed for the last 2 weeks of his life, and his wife was very pregnant and was confined in another room at the other end of the house with a difficult pregnancy, and they didn't tell her that her husband was dying because they didn't want anything to affect her recovery, or the birth and her recovery. So sad. So they kept that from her in hopes that his life could be prolonged long enough so she could regain enough strength to face the severe shock that faced her. When it was clear that he was about to lapse into unconsciousness and had only a few hours left to live, she was informed of her husband's condition and carried to his bedside, where they had a final conversation before his death. And that's the sad story of John Dwyer. We have lots of stories here, but you know, we're in a cemetery, everybody dies at the end of that story, so I apologize in advance. All right, we're going to be going down this way to the Grand Army of the Republic lunch special. Oh, that's his name. Orange is his first name, and Wing is his last, not Chinese. Oh, thank you. And Orange Wing was a police officer briefly in the 1890s. He quit, went back to work for the railroad shops. During the Pullman strike in 1894, the whole town went on strike, and they called out the militia. And they had ancient rifles that were falling apart. And one guy's rifle went off accidentally, hit the cobblestone, split into 6 or 7 different spots, hit 6 or 7 different people, and injured them in the crowd. Wing was the only one who was injured fatally. He was hit in the gut. They took him to his house around the corner, where he died shortly after. Right over here we have James Kent, where where that big cross is. And where are you? Okay. James Kent was a well-respected Civil War vet. This is the Grand Army of the Republic plot. They were all Union War veterans. And they were very politically active and influential. They were kind of snobby too, not as snobby as the pioneers, but they kind of threw their weight around too. And they fought for pensions and stuff for Civil War vets. After the Mexican War vets were kind of like the entitled guys, and then until the Civil War guys came along, and there were a lot more of them than Mexican War vets. Kent, where's Kent? Okay. He worked at the railroad shops also before becoming an officer. And Winnie Marchant is a bar owner who's buried not too far over there. He was playing cards with a guy late one night named C.B. Pressey, and he was winning. Pressey was losing steadily. He was losing lots of money, and he'd even lost his gold watch. And about 5:30 in the morning, their game came to a sudden termination, as did Winnie Marchant's life when Pressey pulled out a revolver and shot him in the chest and ran off. Kent went off to find the guy. And Officer Kent found a suspicious character smoking opium in an opium den. And that sense just seems kind of odd, suspicious character in an opium den. Who would have thought it? And he gave his name as Williams, but he thought for sure it had to be Pressey. So he told the man to put on some clothes, and then asked the women in the room, the attendants, I guess, what the guy's real name was, and turned around slightly, and the guy was gone. He couldn't find him, couldn't figure out, he didn't make any noise. Had to be a trap door or a sliding panel like a movie or something. And that stuff really happened. Sacramento had opium dens downtown, where that big federal building is right now. Opium dens. Opium dens for sure. Eric.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Right here at the border. I'll talk to you about Officer Charles Wetzel. Now, before he became a police officer, Charles Wetzel, the son of a grocery store owner at 4th and N Streets, had been arrested several times for battery. In 1890, his wife, Jessie, committed suicide at the age of 25 by taking a dose of carbolic acid and left him with her children from a previous marriage. In October 1891, he was mentioned as a saloon keeper. So, background. The next year, 1892, he was assigned to be a special officer for K Street from 2nd to 7th Streets. In September 1892, he was found guilty of battery and was fined $10 for using foul language on the witness stand. I guess being an officer of the law didn't help control his temper. George Clark was staying at the Albion Lodging House across from Gassman's Saloon on K between 5th and 6th Streets. Now, George Clark patronized a restaurant across the street frequently, and the owner of that restaurant said he looked like an opium or morphine fiend, just talking about opium dens, and drank considerable too. He has been in here intoxicated several times and was inclined to be quarrelsome and cranky. Now, just before midnight on August 27, 1893, two men, Newton Fisher and another named Friendorf, were singing in front of the saloon, and George Clark didn't appreciate their music. Clark asked how long they intended to sing, and looking at the clock, Fisher saw it was 9 minutes until 12, and told him that it was none of his business, that they had a right to sing until midnight. With that, Clark pulled a pistol from his trousers and struck at Fisher with it, Fisher putting his hands out to deflect the blow. He was about to hit him again when Officer Wetzel stepped up and told him to put down the gun. Clark asked him what he had to do with it, and Wetzel pulled his lapel back to show his star. "I'm an officer," he said, "and I want you to put that gun away." Clark stepped back and then forward again and said, "Maybe you want some of it." He was very close when he fired, with the gun pointing downward. The bullet went through Wetzel's stomach and lodged in his thigh. Clark then coolly walked away when Clark's companion, a woman named Flossie Van Tassel, ran out of the saloon and, catching up with him, said, "George, for God's sake, what have you done?" She pulled Clark away and they ran off, first across the street to his room so he could put on a coat, then away from the scene. Soon, she was soon captured, but Clark led a band of officers and a large crowd of citizens on a chase along the riverfront. He was spotted in the lodging house over the Wells Fargo building at 2nd Street and escaped over the rooftops, officers firing shots at him before he disappeared among the railroad cars on Front Street. Officer Charles Wetzel died of his wounds the morning of August 29th at the age of 28 and was buried here at City Cemetery.
Hey, thank you.
It's okay, you can clap. He's okay.
Whose number is there that you're covering up there?
That's actually it's a security guard badge
Oh,
that
okay.
I painted over.
Whatever works.
So, I love the shade here. Oh, here. This is a picture of Fred Pearl on his bike. Fred Pearl was a police officer, and he was also a member of the Capital City Wheelmen. And played baseball, too, actually. A lot of cops were in the baseball league or, active in sports. Just love that picture. I want to throw that out there. And we are going to dash through the sun to the next shady area to our last couple of stops. Wyatt Earp's nephew. And there's a picture going around him holding a revolver that belonged to his famous uncle, Wyatt Earp. His father was oldest brother Newton Earp. And here we go. Virgil, buried right here. I'm going to come over where the shade is too. Hi there. Virgil was born in Tombstone, Arizona. He wasn't a city of Sacramento police officer, but he claimed to be a lawman in Wyoming, New Mexico, and Arizona. But he was mostly a professional gambler, as several of the Earps were, and had run a gambling hall in Oak Park in the 20s. A disgruntled gambler spread the word that he was out to get Earp. This is in the 20s. Earp disdained police protection, instead bracing the man in the saloon and daring him to step outside and shoot it out. This is not anything, this is 80s, this is 1920. So, the man left town that night, and word spread that you don't mess with Virgil. In February to April of 1958, he was on the game show, The $64,000 Question. and captured $32,000 in his category, the Wild West. He denied that he had been coached on the answers as several of the other contestants later famously claimed, and they made a movie out of it and everything. It was a big court scandal. He said he hadn't been coached. Who could tell me anything about the West? He said. His wife, Jean, died during the filming of the show. And he died a year later, in 1959. And this picture from his obituary that's going around shows him holding a picture of the pistol of his famous uncle, saying that it was his constant companion because we Earps never know when someone out of the past will come looking for us. We had to kill a lot of men as lawmen, and memories are long. I don't know what the accent is. We needed an accent there. So, okay, we're going to go up here to the fireman's plot, and that'll be our last stop. To them, anybody? Yeah. Yeah, you're old. The Whig Party was kind of the precursor to the Republican Party, and he was involved in the squatters' riots. The day after the squatters' riots, Sheriff McKinney went down to a bar in Brighton to bust some people that were involved in the fight, and there was a gunfight there. And Sheriff McKinney was killed, and McDowell was at that gunfight. He was also that's it. That's all that's interesting. Oh, he was on the first fire engine rolled out in response to the first fire in Sacramento. Behind me we have the fireman's plot. Everyone here is a member of the volunteer firemen's department. Sacramento had one of the first paid city fire departments, but most of California had fire departments for a long time. So a lot of these guys are from the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and a lot of them were police. Well, not a lot, but there is crossover. There's some firemen that were policemen as well. And way down at the end there, that blue flag at the end of this plot here, that is William Riker. Riker was a member of Confidence Engine Company #1 who died of dropsy at age 30. He was a former city cop and had served as clerk in the police offices, and he had been suspended from duty for receiving money and other valuables, including a pistol, from prisoners in his charge and appropriating them for his own use, and for visiting gambling houses and gambling while occupying the office of policeman. They didn't have uniforms at that time. So I think they didn't have uniforms until American or 1890s.
It's on the board.
Is it? Okay, yeah. They usually just had, like Wetzel just had a lapel. I had a star on this lapel.
Like the special officer or something.
Yeah. So, in the back here where that other blue flag is, that right over in that area is John Clark. John Clark was a constable and frequently served in that capacity at the Central Pacific Railroad Station downtown at K and 5th Streets. And he was in the habit of jumping on passing trains that were going by, and he didn't wait for it to stop. He missed his footing, slipped, and fell, and was run over by the train just on his leg. And his leg was severely mangled, so the doctors didn't pay very much attention to the little bruises on his head until he started to have paralysis. He had a concussion, and he died from a cerebral hemorrhage from hitting his head. Right over here, this blue flag here is Martin Champney. Here's an ad for his business. He was a police officer in the later 1850s, but before he was a police officer, he was a whip, which was a driver of express wagons.
And he started his own business, which was picking up people at the wharf and taking them wherever they wanted to go in the city, and undercutting his competitors considerably. Anywhere where they wanted to go for only $1 a person. This did not make him popular with his fellow hack drivers, among whom overcharging was a frequent and well-established practice. So he rode with reins in one hand and a pistol in the other one, ready for action. And a rider from the Sacramento Union told of taking a ride with him in his hack that was surrounded by drivers yelling, "Run the horses off the road! Drag the driver from the box! Cut his damn throat! Mash his head!" and other choice epithets. Mash his head. And then, of course, our final story is George Chapman, who is buried right here. Chapman is mentioned up on the board over here, and he was the first police officer killed in the line of duty in Sacramento. He was a special officer. A special officer meant that you weren't one of those 12 full-time officers. You were a part-time guy who was usually paid by businesses to patrol a certain district. And he was in the downtown area, and he was a fireman as well. He was at Protection Engine Company number 2. And one 4th of July in 1857, the fire station was where the fireworks were. And they were loading a cannon with fireworks when it went off and blew up most of his hand where it had to be amputated. That didn't stop him from being a fireman or a police officer. There's notices of him taking place in fires and raids on opium dens and stuff like that. So he apparently could still do the job. They did have benefit for him because he was his mother's only support. And then it's funny, the ad for the aid committee benefit says, "Everyone who enjoys the use of his right hand and has $1 to spare should come forward and contribute it." I agree. All right. Okay, the night in question, April 27th, 1858, Chapman was on duty in the downtown area, and he had his dog with him. He used to patrol with his dog. A merchant was out playing billiards and returned to his shop at 6th and K Streets to find out that he had been robbed, and some clothes were stolen. And there was still a big mound of clothes left outside in the alley that maybe they were going to come back for or something. So he went to the police station, and there was only somebody the desk sergeant on duty, and he said, "There's nobody you can send. If you go out in the street, you'll find a cop." And so he went out and returned to the scene. When they went back to his shop, they found Chapman dead. And there was a small crowd surrounding him. Apparently, he had been patrolling the area. Witnesses heard a hello greeting, and followed by a pistol shot. And someone watching from the hotel saw 2 men struggling. One fell down while the other ran up the alley. The hotel boarder yelled out, "Stop him, he has shot a man." Chapman was shot in the left side of the neck below the ear, causing death instantly. The robbers picked up the clothes they'd left there and went back into the store to take more. They missed the first one. The killers were never apprehended. So, I don't think there's a reward or anything. Chapman's well-attended funeral was at the House of Protection Engine Company number 2, followed by a brass band, as a lot of these guys were, as you can see in some of the photos that had big processions, where they would have start downtown and they would walk all the way down to the cemetery. They'd have the Masons, the Oddfellows, the police, whoever was involved with that person's career. And they would usually end here and be buried, say a few words, and ring the bell. This bell here is a fire bell that used to be in the Oak Park fire station. Is that correct, Eric? Yeah, I know. I
Yeah.
know. I'm looking for you to validate what I'm saying.
Sure, why not?
Yeah, anyway, it was in the Oak Park Fire Station, and cast in England, and this used to be before the freeway. You could hear it really well all across town. If there was a fire, they'd be ringing this bell. And usually at the end of our tours, we let somebody ring the bell. If we have little kids, we don't have any little kids, would you like to ring the bell? All right. There is a, Eric, come on. Yeah, so give it a couple of good pulls. No pressure.
Just hold on to it.
All right. Anybody else that wants to can go ahead and ring that too. This is the end of our tour. Thank you very much for coming. We appreciate your interest. Like I said, I spent dozens of hours researching this and finding those pictures. I'm not paid. If you want to donate money to us, there's the Iron Ranger up front. And also, take a look at Officer Brown's display on the way out. It mentions Max Fisher, Ira Conran, George Chapman, several of the people that we talked about today. So, thank you very much for your